The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty plains of western Montana as Elijah Crawford drove the shovel into the hard earth. At 67, his weathered hands were calloused from decades of ranch work, but they still possessed enough strength for this final task. The plot he'd chosen sat atop a gentle rise on the eastern edge of his property, where the morning sun would warm the ground and where, on clear days, you could see all the way to the Bitterroot Mountains. "This ought to do it," he muttered to himself, pausing to wipe sweat from his brow with a faded bandana. The hole was nearly 4 feet deep now, not the regulation 6 feet of a proper burial, but sufficient for what he had planned. The cancer had spread faster than the doctors anticipated. 3 months, they'd said, but Elijah figured he had less. The pain in his side had become a constant companion, sharper with each passing week. Elijah's nearest neighbor lived 7 miles down the road, and he hadn't spoken to anyone except Dr. Henshaw in nearly 3 weeks. That's how he preferred it. After Beth died 15 years ago, he'd gradually withdrawn from the community that had once been the center of their lives. The annual town barbecues, the church socials, the ranchers' meetings. He'd stopped attending them all. Their daughter Sarah had tried to coax him back to the world for a while, calling weekly from Seattle, but those calls had dwindled to monthly, then holidays, then birthdays. He couldn't blame her. The last time she'd visited with the grandkids was 4 years ago, and he'd barely managed to be civil. The plan was simple. Finish digging today, rest tomorrow, then write the letters, one to Sarah, one to his lawyer in Bozeman. He'd leave instructions for his burial, the disposition of the ranch, and the small savings he'd accumulated. No funeral, no fuss, just as he'd lived these past 15 years. As the sun dipped lower, Elijah heard an unfamiliar sound carried on the breeze, not the lowing of cattle or the call of hawks that typically punctuated the silence of his land. He straightened, wincing as his back protested, and squinted toward the dirt road that connected his ranch to the highway. A small group of figures moved slowly along the road, the dust from their footsteps visible in the slanting sunlight. Children, by the look of them. Elijah frowned. The nearest town was 20 miles away, and children didn't just wander out this way. He climbed out of the shallow grave and walked toward the fence line, curiosity temporarily overriding his desire for solitude. As the group drew closer, he could make out 6 children of varying heights, the oldest appearing to be around 12, the youngest perhaps 5 or 6. Their clothes were dirty and ill-fitting, their faces smudged with dust from the road, but it was their eyes that struck him, hollow, wary, with the unmistakable look of hunger and exhaustion. Elijah had seen that look before, in the faces of refugee children on the evening news, in the aftermath of distant wars and natural disasters. He never expected to see it here, on his own property in Montana. "You kids lost," he called out, his voice rough from disuse. The group stopped, and the tallest boy stepped slightly forward, positioning himself protectively in front of the others. "No, sir," he said, his voice carrying the practiced politeness of a child who'd learned to navigate the adult world carefully. "We're looking for work. Any kind of work. For food." Elijah studied them more carefully now. The oldest boy had his arm around a small girl who couldn't be more than 6. Beside them stood twin boys, maybe 8 years old, with identical wary expressions. A girl of about 10 held the hand of another boy who appeared to be 7 or 8. None of them wore coats, despite the autumn chill that settled over the plains after sundown. "Where are your parents?" Elijah asked, already suspecting the answer. The oldest boy's face hardened slightly. "Don't have any, sir." "All of you?" The boy nodded. "We were at Riverside Children's Home in Billings, but they're closing down. Some of us were going to get split up, sent to different places." He paused, seeming to weigh how much to say. "We decided to find our own way instead." Elijah looked past them down the empty road, then back at the grave he'd been digging. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was preparing for death, while these children were fighting desperately to live. "You kids hungry?" he asked, knowing full well they were starving. 6 pairs of eyes, suddenly alive with hope, stared back at him. Elijah's kitchen hadn't seen this much activity in years. The 6 children sat around his old oak table, devouring the simple meal he'd managed to put together: beans, bacon, and the last of his cornbread. He'd never been much of a cook, even before Beth died, but right now these kids were eating like it was a feast at the Ritz. "Slow down there," he cautioned the youngest girl, who was shoveling food into her mouth at an alarming rate. "Nobody's going to take it from you." Her big eyes, still wary, met his briefly before she nodded and deliberately took smaller bites. The oldest boy, who had introduced himself as Marcus, ate more deliberately than the others, as if rationing his portion. Between bites, he kept glancing at Elijah, clearly sizing him up. "How long have you kids been on the road?" Elijah asked, leaning against the counter with a cup of coffee in his hand. 3 days, Marcus answered. "We took some food from the home when we left, but it ran out yesterday morning." "And where exactly were you planning to go?" The children exchanged glances, and Elijah could see they hadn't thought that far ahead. They were running from, not to. "My uncle lives in Spokane," Marcus finally said. "At least, he did last time I saw him. That was 2 years ago." Elijah nodded, not believing for a moment that this half-formed plan had any chance of success. 6 children on foot trying to reach Spokane, Washington from eastern Montana. They'd never make it, especially with winter coming on. "What's your full name, son?" "Marcus Tate. These are my sisters, Emma and Lily." He gestured to the 10-year-old and the youngest girl, "and our friends James and Jason, the twins, and Riley, the 7-year-old boy who hadn't spoken a word since arriving." Elijah studied them more carefully now. The 3 Tate siblings shared the same dark hair and eyes, while the twins were fair-haired with freckles. Riley had sandy brown hair that fell across his forehead, partially obscuring eyes that darted nervously around the room. "And you all decided to leave together? Just like that?" Marcus straightened in his chair. They were going to send Lily to a family in Great Falls, and Emma to another place. Riley was going to a group home in Miles City. "We've already been split from our families. We were going to be split from each other, too." Elijah couldn't argue with the logic, even if the execution was desperate. Family was family, even when it was chosen rather than born. "Sir," Emma spoke up, her voice surprisingly steady for a 10-year-old. "We can work. Marcus is strong. He can help with ranch work. I can cook and clean. The twins are good with animals." "And what about the little ones?" Elijah asked. "Lily's smart. She can learn quick. And Riley?" Emma hesitated, glancing at the silent boy. "Riley just needs time." Elijah set down his coffee cup and looked out the window. Darkness had fallen completely now, and with it, the temperature had dropped. He could hear the wind picking up, rattling the old window panes. The forecast had called for rain turning to snow in the higher elevations. These kids wouldn't last another night outside. "You can stay tonight," he decided. "I'll make some calls in the morning, figure out who to contact." The relief on their faces was immediate, though Marcus remained cautious. "You won't call the police?" "Not tonight," Elijah promised. "But I can't just keep 6 runaway children. There are laws." The boy nodded, seeming to accept this compromise. Elijah showed them to the spare bedrooms. Beth had insisted on keeping the house bigger than they needed, anticipating grandchildren who rarely visited. The girls took one room, the boys another. He found old T-shirts they could use as night clothes and showed them where the bathroom was. As the children settled in, Elijah returned to the kitchen to clean up. His side ached fiercely now, a reminder of what awaited him. The irony of his situation wasn't lost on him. Here he was, a man preparing for death, suddenly responsible for 6 young lives. He glanced toward the hallway, where soft whispers could still be heard behind closed doors. Tomorrow he'd have to make those calls, do the responsible thing. But tonight, for the first time in years, his house didn't feel empty. The presence of the children had chased away some of the silence that had become his constant companion. Elijah looked out the window toward the half-dug grave on the hill, barely visible in the moonlight. It would still be there tomorrow. Elijah woke before dawn from a dream of Beth. She'd been standing in their kitchen, young again, with sunlight streaming through her hair, telling him something important that he couldn't quite hear. The details faded as consciousness returned, but the feeling remained, a mixture of loss and something else he couldn't name. The unfamiliar sound of children's voices drifted down the hallway, reminding him of his unexpected guests. He dressed slowly, his body stiff and painful, before making his way to the kitchen. To his surprise, he found Emma standing on a chair at the stove, carefully turning pancakes, while Marcus set the table. "We found flour and eggs," Emma explained, looking uncertain whether she'd overstepped. "I hope that's okay." "It's fine," Elijah replied, oddly touched by the gesture. "Though I'm surprised that old stove still works right. Beth always complained about it." "Beth?" Marcus asked. "My wife. She passed 15 years ago." The children nodded with a solemn understanding of those who'd experienced loss themselves. No empty platitudes, no awkward expressions of sympathy, just acknowledgement. After breakfast, while the younger children helped clean up, Elijah took Marcus outside to show him around the property. The morning was crisp, the mountains in the distance capped with fresh snow. "This is all yours?" Marcus asked, taking in the expanse of land. "Been in my family 3 generations," Elijah nodded. "My grandfather built that barn by hand in 1923. As they walked, Elijah found himself telling Marcus about the ranch, how it had once been a working cattle operation, how he'd scaled back after Beth died, keeping just enough livestock to occupy his time. He pointed out the creek that ran along the western border, the old apple orchard that still produced fruit, the workshop where he'd once taught his daughter to build a birdhouse. "Why were you digging that hole yesterday?" Marcus finally asked, pointing to the unfinished grave on the hill. Elijah considered lying, then decided against it. These kids had seen enough of life's harsh realities. They deserved honesty. "I'm sick. Cancer. Doctors say I don't have long." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "So you were digging your own grave?" Seemed practical at the time. The boy looked at him, with eyes far older than 12. "My mom died of cancer 2 years ago. That's how we ended up at Riverside." Elijah nodded, understanding the unspoken connection between them. "I'm sorry about your mom. She fought it hard, right to the end." They stood in silence, looking at the half-dug hole. Then Marcus said, "Seems like bad luck, digging your own grave before you need it." A surprised laugh escaped Elijah. "Maybe you're right." He glanced at the boy. "What would you suggest instead?" "Plant something," Marcus said without hesitation. "My mom always said life keeps going. That's why she liked gardens." Back at the house, Emma had organized the younger children into cleaning teams. The twins were carefully dusting the living room, while Lily sorted through a box of old photographs she'd found. Riley sat quietly in a corner, watching everything but participating in nothing. "You kids don't need to do all this," Elijah protested. "We want to help," Emma insisted. "It's only fair if we're staying here." The mention of staying reminded Elijah of the calls he needed to make. He retreated to his office and reluctantly picked up the phone. The local sheriff was an old acquaintance, someone who might know the proper channels without immediately swooping in to separate the children. But before he could dial, he found himself staring at a photograph on his desk, Beth holding their daughter Sarah at about Lily's age, both smiling broadly at the camera. Behind them stood a younger version of himself, looking at his family with undisguised love. When had that changed? When had he stopped looking at life with anything but resignation? The sound of children's laughter drifted in from the living room, a sound his house hadn't heard in years. He thought of the unfinished grave on the hill, of Marcus's suggestion to plant something instead. He thought of Beth's garden, once the pride of the property, now overgrown with weeds. Elijah set down the phone. The calls could wait another day. First, he had something more important to do. He found the children in the living room, now gathered around an old photo album. "Who wants to learn how to plant an apple tree?" he asked. The next 3 days passed in a blur of activity that Elijah's solitary home hadn't seen in over a decade. What had begun with planting a single apple sapling in place of the abandoned grave site expanded into a full revival of Beth's old garden. The children threw themselves into the work with surprising enthusiasm, their initial wariness gradually giving way to a cautious comfort. "My mom grew tomatoes on our apartment balcony," Emma shared as she helped Elijah clear weeds from the overgrown beds. Her hands, small but determined, pulled at the stubborn roots with fierce concentration. "Beth loved tomatoes," Elijah replied, finding it easier each day to speak his wife's name aloud. She'd eat them right off the vine, still warm from the sun. The twins, James and Jason, proved to be tireless workers, competing to see who could clear the most ground or carry the heaviest load of compost. They reminded Elijah of himself and his brother as boys, before life and distance had pulled them apart. Even little Lily found ways to help, sorting seeds and carefully watering the newly turned earth. Only Riley remained apart, watching from the porch steps, his silence a wall between him and the others. On the fourth morning, Elijah woke to find Marcus already outside, repairing a section of fence that had fallen into disrepair years ago. Thought this might keep the deer out of the garden, the boy explained when Elijah approached, hammer in hand. Elijah nodded, impressed by both the initiative and the craftsmanship. You've done this before. My dad was a carpenter. Before he left, Marcus drove another nail with practiced precision. He taught me some things. They worked side by side for an hour, the rhythm of their hammers filling the morning air. Elijah found himself sharing knowledge almost unconsciously, showing Marcus how to check if a post was truly plumb, how to stretch wire without warping it, tricks his own father had taught him decades ago. Inside the house, Emma had taken charge of the kitchen, revealing a talent for creating meals from whatever sparse ingredients Elijah's pantry offered. The night before, she'd somehow transformed canned beans, rice, and the last of his frozen venison into a stew that had the younger children asking for seconds. We need to go to town for supplies, Elijah announced at lunch. Food mainly, and some proper clothes for all of you. The children exchanged nervous glances. They'll be looking for us, Marcus said quietly. Probably, Elijah agreed. But you can't hide out here forever. Are you going to turn us in? Emma asked, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Elijah considered his answer carefully. In the 4 days since the children had arrived, he'd made no calls. Not to the sheriff, not to social services, not even to his doctor for the pain medication he was running low on. Each morning, he told himself he would make those calls after breakfast, or after lunch, or before bed. Each day, he'd found reasons to delay. I don't know yet, he admitted honestly, but I do know you need proper food and warm clothes. Winter's coming. In the end, they reached a compromise. Elijah would go to town alone, bringing back necessities. The children would remain at the ranch, with Marcus in charge. If Elijah didn't return by nightfall, they would take the emergency cash he kept in his desk and continue their journey. The drive into town felt strange after so many days in the children's company. The silence in the truck cab seemed heavier than before, the empty passenger seat more noticeable. As he pulled into the parking lot of Jensen's General Store, Elijah was struck by how little the town had changed in the years he'd been avoiding it. Helen Jensen looked up in surprise when he walked through the door. Elijah Crawford, as I live and breathe. Thought you might have fallen off the edge of the earth. Not quite yet, he replied with a nod, grabbing a shopping cart. As he moved through the aisles, filling the cart with more food than he'd bought in years, Helen watched curiously. You hosting a family reunion or something? She asked as she rang up his purchases. Something like that, Elijah murmured, adding children's clothing and a pair of new work boots in Marcus's size to the pile. On impulse, he added 6 notebooks and a pack of colored pencils. The children had mentioned missing school, despite their determination to stay together. Perhaps he could help with that, at least until he figured out what to do next. As Helen totaled his purchases, her eyes lingered on the children's items. Everything okay out at your place, Elijah? He met her gaze steadily, getting better every day. The truck was loaded with supplies when Elijah spotted Sheriff Dave Hollister's patrol car pulling into the parking lot. His heart sank as Dave stepped out and waved him down. Elijah, the sheriff nodded. Been a while. Heard you were in town. Just picking up some things, Elijah replied cautiously. Dave leaned against the truck, his expression friendly, but his eyes sharp. Helen mentioned you bought enough groceries to feed an army, or maybe 6 runaway kids from the Riverside home in Billings. Elijah's silence confirmed what Dave already suspected. Got a call from the director there 3 days ago. Dave continued. 6 children disappeared right before the place was set to close down. Someone spotted them heading west on foot. He paused. Anything you want to tell me, Elijah? For a moment, Elijah considered denying everything. But lies had never come easily to him, and Dave had known him too long. They showed up at my place 4 days ago, he admitted. Hungry, exhausted. The oldest boy says they were going to be split up. Dave nodded. That's the story I got too. 3 siblings and 3 unrelated kids who've been together since they lost their families. System's overwhelmed. Placements are scarce. They were trying to keep the siblings together at least. They've been through enough, Elijah said firmly. Being separated would break them. I don't disagree, Dave sighed. But harboring runaways is still against the law, Elijah. I've got to report this. Elijah leaned heavily against the truck, suddenly aware of the pain in his side that had been oddly absent during the busy days with the children. How much time do I have? He asked. Dave studied him for a long moment. You look like hell, Elijah. You still seeing that doctor in Bozeman? Cancer spread, Elijah said simply. Few months at most. The sheriff's face softened. I'm sorry to hear that. Beth would've. He trailed off, then cleared his throat. Those kids mean something to you, don't they? They showed up right when I was digging my own grave, Elijah admitted. Literally digging it, Dave. Had the shovel in my hand. Dave was silent for a moment, processing this. Jesus, Elijah. They need someone. I need. Elijah paused, surprised by the realization forming. I need them. You're talking about taking in 6 children while you're dying of cancer, Dave said bluntly. That's not a solution. Maybe not long term, Elijah acknowledged. But right now they're safe, they're together, and they're bringing life back to a place that's been as good as dead for 15 years. The sheriff rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. I've got a cousin who works for Family Services in Helena. Let me make some calls, see what options might exist. But Elijah, he fixed him with a serious look. This is temporary, you understand? Those kids need stability, especially with what they've been through. I understand, Elijah nodded. How much time? I can give you a week, maybe 2, before I have to officially report them found. Use it wisely. Elijah drove home with a mixture of relief and anxiety. The supplies in the back of his truck would keep the children fed and clothed, but Dave's warning weighed heavily on his mind. 2 weeks wasn't much time to figure out a solution that would keep the children together. When he pulled up to the house, all 6 children were waiting anxiously on the porch. They rushed to help unload the truck, exclaiming over new clothes and the treats he'd included. Chocolate bars and a bag of apples, books and the notebooks he'd impulsively purchased. That evening, after dinner, Elijah sat on the porch watching the sunset. Marcus joined him, carrying 2 cups of coffee. You went to town and came back, the boy said, handing Elijah a cup. You kept your word. I try to, Elijah replied. But someone knows we're here now, don't they? Marcus asked perceptively. Elijah saw no point in lying. The sheriff. He's giving us some time to figure things out. Marcus nodded, seeming unsurprised. We knew we couldn't hide forever. No, Elijah agreed. But maybe we can find a better solution than running. They sat in companionable silence as the sky turned from gold to purple. Inside, Emma was teaching Lily to read from one of the new books, while the twins built an elaborate structure from scrap wood Elijah had given them. Even Riley had shown signs of emerging from his shell, sketching quietly in his new notebook. I've been thinking, Elijah said finally. It's time I made a call to my daughter.